Our spire comes from one of the many Christopher Wren churches in London, and it's a great spire to illustrate the 3 tips to keep in mind when we're drawing spires. The first tip is don't let the relative simplicity of a spire fool you. We need to check the perspective of the spire just as much as in a more complex building. And the first thing to look at is the angles. And in this 2-point perspective view, with the perspective off to the left side vanishing point, we can see, as we expect, the higher we go above eye level, the greater the angle increases of the perspective lines. So this reminds us that we need to increase the angle as we go up. It also just reminds us to look more carefully for the angle. And the angles going off to the right-hand side are just as important, but the right-hand side is at a shallower angle than the left-hand side. So therefore the perspective angles are less, but they still increase the higher they go. But there's more to observe with perspective than just the perspective angles. Foreshortening is important here. It's the principle that the further away something goes, the more visually compressed it becomes. And although this is a square tower, the left-hand side, because of the angle we're looking at it from, actually goes away from us more than the right-hand side. So because the left-hand side is further away, it compresses more. So in effect, it looks narrower than the right-hand side. So when I draw, I have to not just start to draw them as if they're both the same. And I can see quite easily that this window is wider than this window. And although it's not as obvious, now that I'm looking for it, I can see that this rectangular window is not as wide as this rectangular window. And in fact, it's probably most obvious here on this circular window that this ellipse is a more oval and less round shape than this one. This ellipse is still looking a bit rounder because we're not looking at it front on, but more front on than we are this one. So we can see all the patterns of perspective working here. Now my second tip, it's look for the stacked shapes. Sometimes our spire is a very simple, tall, thin pyramid that just sits on a square base, but mostly they're a bit fancier than that, and sometimes they're extremely ornate. So this is what I do. I don't usually draw it out unless it's a very complicated series of stack shapes, but I go through this process. So here we have 3 different stackings of shapes on our square tower. We have this section here, and we have this shape that sits on it, and then we have the actual pointy part of the spire. And what I do is I try to imagine a cutaway view so I know exactly what I'm drawing. So for instance, with this section here, it's basically a square, although it's fancier than a square. I want to understand the ways in which it moves away from being a square so that I can draw it accurately. But if I start with the square, that is a simple shape. And so I can see that it protrudes on the corners. And then I'm going to reflect the fact that it sits like this on the corners. And I also notice that this is not a straight line, it actually curves inwards. But basically, this is a section through this lower part of the spire. So by understanding how it's formed, it helps me to draw it more accurately. So now I want to consider the shape on top. And it's a similar process. However, instead of a curve that goes inwards, on this section, the curve goes outwards. And I imagine, drawn accurately, it actually forms a perfect circle. This is what sits on this in this way. I wouldn't actually have drawn this out in this way, but this is the process I'm going through in my mind to understand exactly what shapes are here and how they stack. When I look at the base of the actual spire that sits on top, it looks like it just comes out to a point, but that I think these are straight. If they're not, they're so close to straight, it doesn't really matter. So there we have my second tip for drawing spires. Take a few minutes to understand the structure of the spire, particularly what shapes are stacked on top of one another. My third tip is really quick. It's pay attention to the center line. And by the center line, I mean the point that starts at the very apex of the spire and goes straight down vertically. And the reason why it's important to work this out at the start is that it's not necessarily in the center. Well, it's not necessarily in what looks like the center. So for instance, this edge here, it would be very easy to center all of our stack shapes on this line. But if we look, we can see that the higher up we go, our spire, the more the sections move slightly to the right. Now, if we were standing straight onto this corner so that both these sides went off at 45 degrees to us, the center line would actually go up right through the center of this edge and through the center of the top. But because we're shifted slightly more to one side, the fact that these sections are each step back from each other shifts where the center line actually is. And as I go up and stack my shapes, I need to stack them to the right, so to speak. So that's my third tip. Pay attention to the center line and to how all the various elements line up with that center line. So let's draw it then, shall we? G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. Spires are great architectural structures to draw. They're so interesting, but it can be tricky to end up with them looking straight, especially more complex ones when there's lots of elements to bring together. But I hope these 3 tips pay attention to the perspective lines, consider the spire as a series of stacked shapes and look at those shapes carefully, and then pay attention to the center line because it may not always be where you expect it to be. I think using those tips should help your spires become straighter and straighter. And a 4th tip as a reward for all of you who've persevered to this point, thank you, is while you're drawing the spire, don't forget to stand back and have a look from a little bit further away. We can be so intense and so close up with our drawing that sometimes we need the perspective of being a bit further away just to check whether it's really emerging straight or not, because there may still be time for some adjustments. And if not, there's always another spire. So keep drawing, have fun, see you next time.